And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode explores the dismantling of the US Department of Education as more than just a political event. It treats it as a profound philosophical moment in American life. Rather than offering a partisan defense or a reactionary critique, this episode takes a thoughtful, layered look at what it means when a nation withdraws from the idea of public education as a collective responsibility. Drawing on thinkers like Hannah Arendt, John Dewey, Michel Foucault, and bell hooks, the episode moves beyond headlines and into deeper questions. What happens when education becomes fragmented, localized, and politicized? Who gets to decide what counts as knowledge, and what do we lose, not just logistically, but morally, when the state steps away from the classroom? This isn't just about policy. It's about power, memory, and the kind of future we imagine for children we may never meet. Whether you're an educator, a parent, a policymaker, or simply someone who believes in the idea of a shared civic world, this episode offers a nuanced and emotionally resonant exploration of one of the most consequential shifts in recent American governance. If you value thoughtful, challenging conversations like this one, we'd be grateful if you left a rating or review on iTunes. Listener engagement helps us stay visible, viable, and connected to those who care about these ideas. Thanks for supporting the show, and while you're doing that, let's dive in. When the federal government exits the classroom, it doesn't leave it empty, it leaves it vulnerable. On a quiet March morning, Donald Trump stood beneath a wash of state flags, surrounded by children sitting at tiny desks, and signed the order that would begin the dismantling of the US Department of Education. He smiled. His education secretary smiled. The children, likely coached to do so, smiled too. The moment was choreographed, deliberate pageantry in place of policy. But beneath the optics was a deeper rupture. A philosophical retreat from the very notion that education is a shared civic duty. It marked the withdrawal not just of money or regulation, but of belief. Belief in the idea that the state has a role to play in ensuring that a child's future isn't determined by their zip code, their body, or the politics of their parents' school board. In that instant, the image of governance didn't resemble stewardship, it resembled abandonment. There's a strange stillness to that kind of power. Not the storm of revolution, but the silence of erasure. The moment a public good becomes a private burden, something fractures. And while the executive order itself might seem like just another flashpoint in America's long ideological whiplash, it signals something deeper. This wasn't a move to fix what was broken. It was a declaration that the shared mechanisms of care, imperfect, bloated, contested as they may be, no longer deserve to exist at all. Bureaucracy may frustrate, but its erasure is rarely about freedom. More often, it's about clearing the field for something colder, something less accountable, something that doesn't have to call itself by name. In that room, surrounded by symbols of the Republic, the state quietly told its children, "You are on your own now." There was no grief, no solemnity, just the tidy logic of a line item. And for those paying attention, the message was clear. The responsibility to educate no longer rests with the union. It now lies with the market, the family, the ideology of the moment. This is what it looks like when a nation withdraws from its own promise, not in shouts, but in signatures. The classroom remains, the desks remain, the flags remain, but something has been emptied out. Not just funding, not just oversight, something harder to name, something closer to trust. The children sat quietly, their small desks arranged like chess pieces in front of the East Room stage. Trump stood behind a podium framed by state flags that suggested unity, even as the act itself promised fragmentation. Linda McMahon, a business magnate turned education secretary, watched from the front row, nodding with what looked like satisfaction. The optics were curated to suggest progress, clarity, bold leadership. But there was an eerie tension in the scene, something performative in the presence of children whose futures were being reshaped without their knowing. This was not policy-making in motion, it was symbolism in disguise. A televised moment meant less to inform and more to assert. The state was not merely reforming education, it was excusing itself from the table. The ceremony wasn't about content or curriculum. It wasn't even about budgets. Not really. It was about announcing a break. The idea that the federal government should serve as any kind of guarantor of educational equity had become, in this vision, obsolete. Trump's words were clipped, businesslike. The department was bloated, ineffective, unnecessary. "We're going to shut it down, and shut it down as quickly as possible," he said, his voice flat with certainty. The children didn't flinch. They were props, not participants. The staging said everything. The future being spoken about was not one they were meant to shape, only endure. Behind the executive order was a familiar logic. Send education back to the states, return power to parents. These phrases, repeated like mantras, masked a more consequential truth, that what was being relinquished wasn't just control, it was responsibility. The Department of Education, for all its flaws, had represented the federal commitment to at least try to balance the scales, to fund schools in poor districts, to protect the rights of disabled students, to enforce civil rights in classrooms that often forgot them. With a stroke of the pen and the murmur of applause, that commitment was undone, or at least rebranded as overreach. It was easy to miss the violence of the moment. No doors slammed, no papers burned, no dramatic exits. But the implications were seismic. Power didn't leave the room. It just changed clothes. The promise of national stewardship had been replaced by a quieter assertion that education, like so much else, was better managed by those who could afford to care. The children at the desks kept their hands folded. History had just passed over them, and they hadn't even been asked to blink. This wasn't the first time the Department of Education had been marked for erasure. Its origins have long been contested, its survival periodically threatened by waves of ideological fervour. In 1980, it was born into skepticism, carved out of the Department of Health, Education and Welfare under Jimmy Carter, and immediately targeted by Ronald Reagan, who pledged to eliminate it as part of his vision for smaller government. The idea never fully disappeared. It lingered like an unfinished sentence in conservative manifestos and campaign promises, gaining traction in think tanks and fringe policy circles that would over time become mainstream. The current dismantling did not emerge from chaos. It followed a script. Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for remaking the federal government, laid the groundwork with surgical precision. In that document, the Department of Education is not seen as a flawed tool to be reformed, but as an illegitimate entity to be stripped down to statistical reporting and dissolved into a data provider for state governments. It's not that the state should serve less, it's that the state, in their view, should not serve at all. At least not when it comes to shaping what children learn, who they learn with, or what values thread through their formative years. In this context, Trump's executive order doesn't read as spontaneous authoritarianism, it reads as fulfillment. A culmination of decades of ideological erosion where public education was steadily reframed not as a civil right but as a commodity. The tools were laid long before the signatures arrived, block grants replacing targeted aid, state flexibility promoted over federal accountability, the rise of school voucher programs pitched as freedom rather than withdrawal. The move to shutter the department is not radical. It is the natural endpoint of a philosophy that has always distrusted the federal project of equity. Even the language has been consistent. Local control has long been code for selective inclusion. Parents' rights increasingly signals a narrowing of what stories, identities, and truths children are allowed to encounter. The current moment is not a departure from tradition. It's a reckoning with how long the groundwork has been in place, and how many were willing to ignore it until the walls began to come down. The building wasn't raised in a day, it was hollowed out from within, floor by floor, policy by policy, until one day someone stood up, looked around and said, "This place isn't worth saving." What's lost doesn't show up in press releases. It doesn't announce itself with headlines or make for a compelling soundbite. It shows up in slower ways, in the absence of a speech therapist at a rural elementary school, in a special education classroom that no longer has enough aides to help students eat lunch or change into gym clothes, in a school counsellor's office that now rotates between 3 buildings, reachable only on Thursdays. These aren't just logistical failures. They are the quiet unravelling of a promise, one that said, No matter where you're born or how much your parents earn, there will be something waiting for you. A desk, a teacher, a chance. The Department of Education's most powerful function was never what it dictated, but what it guaranteed. Title I funding made sure schools in high-poverty areas weren't operating entirely in the shadow of scarcity. IDEA grants made it possible for students with disabilities to be supported, seen, and included in ways that weren't dependent on a district's tax base. These weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. And yet, to hear the rhetoric of the dismantling, you'd think these programs were bureaucratic indulgences, fat to be trimmed in the name of freedom. But what does freedom mean to a child who can't get through a day without an aid? What does local control offer to the family of a nonverbal sixth grader whose school no longer has a qualified interpreter? The abstraction of policy becomes violence when it removes the tools that make a child feel safe, supported, or simply possible. No child sees a budget line. They see a door that either opens or does not. They see whether someone shows up, whether someone stays. The dismantling doesn't just erase programs, it erodes faith. Faith that the state sees all children, not just those who fit a dominant mould. Faith that hardship doesn't disqualify a child from being educated with dignity. The cruelest part is that the harm is so evenly spread, so quietly administered, that no one moment feels dramatic enough to spark outrage. But in classrooms across the country, the lights are dimming. Not all at once. One bulb at a time. There is no headline for that. No camera crew arrives when a teacher's aide is laid off or a rural district quietly eliminates its music programme. But the losses accumulate and they teach their own lesson. Some students matter less. Some futures are worth investing in. Others, apparently, are not. The erosion of federal education is not just a logistical failure, it's a philosophical abandonment. Hannah Arendt once wrote that education is where we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it. To educate is to admit the young into a common world, to prepare them for plurality, for difference, for the dissonant beauty of democratic life. When a government retreats from this responsibility, it is not simply downsizing. It is declaring that the maintenance of the public realm, the shared space of meaning, memory, and moral obligation, is no longer its concern. Arendt was clear. Children do not belong wholly to the private world of the family, nor do they arrive ready to enter the public world of politics. They exist in between, in a delicate space that must be protected and cultivated. Schools, for her, are not factories of knowledge, but thresholds, spaces where the old world meets the new. And it is precisely because children cannot yet choose the world they are born into that we, the adults, are called to make it livable, legible, and if we are brave, lovable. The dismantling of the Department of Education suggests that this interstitial space is no longer sacred, that the bridge between the private home and the public square no longer needs to be built, or worse, that it is no longer wanted. In place of shared curricula, we are offered fragmented standards. In place of protections for marginalised students, we are told to trust the judgment of local boards, increasingly shaped by ideological purity tests. The result is not diversity, it is isolation. Each district becomes its own island, its own truth, its own history. What binds us dissolves. To abandon education as a public endeavour is to abandon the notion of a common world. And when that happens, something profound is lost. Not just opportunity, but orientation. Children are left to navigate a fractured landscape of conflicting truths, where authority is unstable and memory is negotiable. They inherit a world that does not hang together. Arendt's warning was not about test scores or funding models. It was about what happens when adults abdicate their duty to prepare the world for those who will inherit it. When the state steps back, it does not just create space, it creates absence. And into that absence rushes whatever is loudest, angriest, most certain of its own rightness. If we no longer educate in common, can we still live in common? Or do we become strangers raising strangers? There is a dangerous comfort in believing that education is neutral, that it simply transmits facts, prepares for tests, moves children along a conveyor belt toward adulthood. But education is never neutral. It is a system of permissions and omissions, of memory and erasure. And when the federal government steps aside, it does not leave a vacuum. It leaves a contested field where those with the loudest voices and clearest agendas seize the power to decide what is known, what is forgotten, and what is forbidden. Michel Foucault understood institutions not as passive bureaucracies, but as architectures of power. Schools, in his view, are not just places of instruction. They are sites of discipline, where knowledge and behaviour are shaped according to dominant norms. Who controls curriculum controls identity. Who writes the standards writes the memory. When federal protections fall away, local authorities don't simply fill the gap. They redefine the terms. And increasingly, those terms are not about inclusion or inquiry, but about control. We've already seen what this looks like. State legislatures banning books that explore gender, race or sexuality. Teachers' silence for acknowledging the existence of systemic inequality. School boards demanding ideological conformity under the banner of parental rights. These are not isolated incidents. They are coordinated efforts to reshape the boundaries of permissible thought. The state doesn't need to police students directly when it can deputize fear, incentivize silence, and punish deviation through funding cuts or public shaming. And it's not just the content of education that is being revised, it's its purpose. Instead of cultivating critical thinkers, the system is being retooled to produce compliant citizens, loyal to a narrowed vision of nationhood. The 1776 Commission, revived under Trump, does not offer history, it offers myth. It does not ask students to understand the past. It asks them to accept a version of it, unexamined and unchallenged. This is not education. It is orthodoxy dressed as pedagogy. Foucault would call this a reconfiguration of power, less visible, more insidious. Not the imposition of force, but the management of what can be imagined. When federal oversight dissolves, what remains is not freedom, but a fracturing of truth. Education becomes a performance of allegiance rather than an invitation to think. The classroom, once a space of discovery, becomes a space of caution. And the child learns the lesson early. Knowledge is not what you seek, is what you are permitted to repeat. The battle over education is not simply a policy debate, it's a cultural referendum. It asks, often without saying so directly, who counts, what stories deserve to be told, and whose experience is deemed valid enough to enter the collective imagination. When federal protections vanish, when diversity initiatives are dismantled, and when curriculum is stripped of complexity, what remains is not a neutral framework. It is a curated silence. And into that silence rushes the machinery of fear, ideology, and nostalgia dressed as virtue. In recent years, classrooms have become front lines, not in the figurative sense, but literally. Teachers doxed for including inclusive texts, school board meetings flooded with vitriol, students instructed not to ask questions that might make someone uncomfortable. It's not just a rollback, it's a campaign against nuance, against empathy, against anything that might complicate the preferred narrative. When parents' rights are elevated above students' needs, when banning a book becomes an act of protection rather than censorship, we are no longer debating education. We are negotiating the terms of reality. What is happening is not accidental. It is coordinated. Think tanks, media networks, and political operatives have turned education into a wedge, one more lever in a broader strategy to polarize the electorate by fragmenting the shared ground beneath it. The classroom becomes a symbolic space, less about literacy or numeracy than about identity affirmation and cultural dominance. Who gets to be seen? Who gets to speak? Who is absent and why? Consider the curriculum debates that erase queer voices, flatten histories of enslavement, or present settler colonialism as a footnote to national greatness. This isn't about historical accuracy, it's about narrative control. A generation is being raised not on facts, but on comfort, taught to prize a sense of security over an encounter with truth. And the cost of that comfort is paid by those whose lives are rendered invisible in the process. The result is not a more democratic school system, but a more fragile one. A place where the boundaries of inquiry narrow with each legislative cycle, and where learning becomes less about exploration and more about affirmation. We are no longer asking students to understand the world. We are asking them to fit into someone else's version of it. And in that quiet shift, the very purpose of education begins to decay, not with force, but with permission. Not with rage, but with retreat. There comes a point in the essay where critique sharpens into revelation. This isn't a policy failure, a bureaucratic misstep, or even a populist overcorrection. It is the embodiment of a governing philosophy that does not believe in the public as a moral category. To dismantle the Department of Education is not to say it failed, it is to assert that its mission was never legitimate, that the idea of a collective responsibility for children, strangers to us but citizens all the same, is a fiction too costly to maintain. This is not mismanagement, it's design. An ideological architecture laid brick by brick over decades, now unveiled without apology. The state isn't shrinking in shame, it is retreating in triumph, guided by a belief that society should not be built through shared investment, but through private initiative. That charity is preferable to justice, that markets, not institutions, should decide who thrives and who is left behind. In this worldview, equity isn't a goal, it's an overreach, and education isn't a right, it's a product. What's replacing federal stewardship isn't nothing, it's something very specific. A network of deregulated power, school vouchers that pull funding from public districts, parents' rights bills that restrict what can be taught, private religious institutions emboldened to accept public dollars without public accountability. This isn't a vacuum. It's an ecosystem engineered to favour those who already hold cultural and economic power. And in the process, the language of freedom becomes its own inversion, used to justify exclusion, silence, and flight from complexity. When Donald Trump declares that the Department of Education is doing us no good, it is not a diagnosis, it's a worldview made plain. It tells us that public systems are suspect, that bureaucracy is inherently broken, and that the future belongs to those who can afford to buy their way into it. The classroom, once a symbol of collective aspiration, is being rebranded as a site of contested control, not a sanctuary, not a commons, a battlefield. And so the dismantling is not a glitch, it is a revelation of what this vision of governance intends to build in place of the public, a hollowed-out shell dressed in patriotic language, void of shared purpose, not a failed promise, but a refusal to promise at all. The real question isn't how we got here, it's what kind of country emerges when it no longer believes it owes anything to the children it doesn't already know. The child still sits at the desk. Maybe it's the same desk from the ceremony, maybe it's in a school without a librarian or in a district that's cut its arts programs to keep the lights on. Maybe it's a classroom where the teacher buys their own supplies, where the heating breaks in January, where the hallway murals are fading. Or maybe it's a new building with bright walls and polished chrome, but behind those doors certain books are missing. Certain questions can't be asked, and certain children don't see themselves in anything they read. The desk remains, but the world around it has shifted. Bell hooks reminded us that education is not neutral ground, it is a space where liberation can begin or where submission is enforced. It is the terrain where the child first learns not only what is possible, but what is permitted. When the federal government abdicates its role, when it removes itself from the messy work of ensuring equity, protection and access, it doesn't empower freedom, it empowers indifference. The state's silence becomes the loudest message of all, that some children will be carried and others will be left to walk alone. And yet the child still imagines, even in the absence. Even in a classroom where support is gone, or fear has taken root, or the past has been whitewashed into fable. Children dream in spite of the curriculum. They read between the redacted lines, they find new language in the margins. The question is not whether they will imagine, the question is whether we will rise to meet what they imagine with something worthy. This is not a call to nostalgia. The Department of Education was never perfect. It was bureaucratic, slow, often reactive. But it represented something rare, an attempt, however flawed, to see every child at once, to say, from the centre of power that someone was watching, someone was trying, someone cared enough to intervene. What happens when that presence vanishes? What replaces it, and who gets to decide? The child still sits at the desk. The future, unwritten, stares back. What they learn will depend on what we defend. What they believe will be shaped by what we refuse to forget. And if public education collapses not from violence but from neglect, then rebuilding it will require more than outrage. It will require imagination and faith. not in systems, but in each other. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced, and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources, and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform